It was a mystery that had haunted the small town for decades. The Harper family, known for their introverted ways and community involvement, vanished without a trace on that fateful summer night when they didn't show up at the banquet they usually volunteered for. Neighbors found the house empty, and search parties soon scoured the town. It seemed like the Harpers remained lost to the town and the world for that matter, as detectives ran into dead ends. However, 30 years later, during a routine police interview, their next-door neighbor uttered a confession that reopened the case. After the Harper family's disappearance, the little town was never quite the same. Nothing ever seemed to happen before that moment, and no matter how hard the police tried, they were never even able to get a whiff of where they could have gone. The routine interviews were not just out of courtesy, but because the whole town still held on to hope that the Harper family would be found again. People had started to speculate too. Maybe they had just moved without saying anything, or maybe had taken a plane and gone somewhere. Detective Thomas knew that this was false. However, he had contact with any police department that would listen. He had even contacted immigration, but no one was able to find anything. Still, the police didn't give up, hoping that the cold case of the Harper family would one day finally reveal an all-important clue so that they might reopen the case once more. They could never have guessed that today would be that day. It was time to interview anyone who had been close to the Harper family again, and it seemed to be Bill's turn. Bill was only 37, meaning he was only 7 years old when it happened. He and the eldest of the Harper family, Evan, had been friends until the moment of their disappearance. These were the words that he would usually say, along with the claim of not remembering much else. However, today seemed to be different, as he came in rather nervous. The officers thought nothing of it and simply sat Bill down. "Hey, Billy," the old Detective Thomas said, greeting him with a warm smile as he remembered the first time he sat in front of them, still shaken by the loss of his neighbors and with it, his best friend. "I'm going to ask you some questions. Please answer them as honestly as your memory allows." Detective Thomas continued. These had been the same words he was using for years of the investigation, but never before had they been this fruitful. He had written down notes of what Bill usually said, but it seemed like he had deviated from the lines he had told the detective and other officers on repeat. No, this time Billy Layton went off script, and no one had seen it coming. "I only recently remembered." Bill started off lying as his eyes zoomed around the room, hesitantly. He was wringing his hands together, a nervous tic he had developed over the years. "The day before they disappeared, I had been playing in the living room when I had seen my parents go over to the Harper's house." Detective Thomas wrote this down, hanging on to Bill's lips with every word he spoke. Not at any age had he shown to have known anything about the family's disappearance. His story usually went along the lines of Billy not having seen Evan or his family for a couple of days prior to their disappearance, yet now that seemed to be the furthest from the truth. "You see, my dad was standing on Miss Harper's porch talking to her, but they looked relatively mad at each other. My mom and Evan looked more so concerned, and my mom just kept glancing over her shoulder. It had been her interrupting the conversation that had caused them to stop talking and instead go inside the Harper's house," Bill explained as Detective Thomas fervently wrote everything down. "Do you know what the conversation was about? Any clue on the matter?" he asked as soon as he finished writing. Bill immediately shook his head. "No, sir, but I know that it wasn't pretty. Dad was pretty mad when he came back home." Detective Thomas frowned. Bill had seen the following question coming, but was still not prepared for it. "Did you hear your father or mother say anything after coming home about what it could have been about?" Detective Thomas asked. Bill became nervous once again. "Nothing that jumped out at the time. I didn't really understand it back then." He was interrupted by the detective. "What made you choose to unveil this information now?" Bill swallowed loudly. "I think the people deserve to know where the Harpers are. I think this mystery needs to be solved, and I'm happy to help the police with that. As I too would like to know where they went." "My parents never decided to tell me," he answered, and it seemed a satisfactory answer to the detective. Detective Thomas called his team into the briefing room. "All right, everyone, we have new information on the Harper case," he said, tapping the whiteboard. Bill Layton mentioned seeing his parents at the Harpers the day before they disappeared. "This could be our break." The team leaned in, eyes wide with anticipation. "We need to verify Bill's story." Let's start by re-interviewing his parents, Thomas continued, scribbling notes. This could change everything. The team quickly agreed on their next steps. Let Bill's parents, Officer Ramirez suggested. We need to know if what Bill said about the argument is true. Detective Thomas nodded.
Exactly.
We have to tread carefully. It's been 30 years. They might not be forthcoming. The team exchanged glances, knowing this would be a delicate operation. Let's do this right, Thomas concluded. We owe it to the Harpers. Detective Thomas and Officer Ramirez drove to Bill's parents' house. The old neighborhood looked the same, but the air felt heavier. Knocking on the late 70s door, they waited. Mrs. Layton opened it, surprise evident on her face. Detective officer, what brings you here? She asked, trying to mask her unease. We need to ask you some questions about the Harpers, Thomas replied gently. She hesitated, then let them in. The tension was palpable inside. Mr. Layton sat stiffly on the couch, his eyes darting nervously. Mrs. Layton busied herself in the kitchen, avoiding eye contact. Thank you for seeing us, Detective Thomas began, noting their discomfort. We need to ask about the argument Bill mentioned. Mr. Layton's jaw tightened. It was a long time ago, he muttered. We don't remember much. Mrs. Layton's hands shook as she poured coffee. Silence hung heavy in the air. Detective Thomas leaned forward, eyes fixed on Mr. Layton. Bill told us about an argument with Mrs. Harper. Can you tell us more about it? Mr. Layton's face flushed. I don't know what Bill thinks he saw, he stammered, shifting uncomfortably. It was nothing serious. Thomas pressed on. Please, Mr. Layton, any detail could help. The tension in the room grew. Mrs. Layton's eyes were downcast. Mr. Layton's evasiveness only raised more questions. Detective Thomas leaned in closer. Mr. Layton, we need the truth. Mr. Layton sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. All right, I did have an argument with Mrs. Harper. It was over a personal matter, but it wasn't serious. Mrs. Layton shot him a worried glance. It had nothing to do with their disappearance, he insisted, his voice shaking. Detective Thomas scribbled notes, sensing there was more to uncover. Turning to Mrs. Layton, he asked, Did you go inside the Harper's house? Mrs. Layton nodded reluctantly. Yes, we went inside, but nothing unusual happened, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We talked, and then we left. Her hands trembled as she spoke. Are you sure? Thomas pressed. She glanced at her husband before nodding again. Yes, absolutely sure, she repeated, her eyes avoiding his. Detective Thomas and Officer Ramirez exchanged frustrated looks. We need more details, Thomas urged. What did you talk about? Mr. Layton shook his head. It was personal detective stuff, nothing related to their disappearance. Mrs. Layton added, We just had a disagreement. The detectives could sense they were holding back, but the Laytons wouldn't budge. The air in the room grew thick with tension and unspoken truths as Detective Thomas and Officer Ramirez prepared to leave. Ramirez noticed something. Mrs. Layton kept glancing nervously at a locked cabinet in the living room. What's in there? He asked, pointing to it. Mrs. Layton's face went pale. Oh, just old family stuff, she replied quickly. Ramirez exchanged a knowing look with Thomas. All right, thank you for your time, Thomas said, suspicion growing as they walked out. Back at the station, Detective Thomas was deep in thought. We need to get a warrant to search the Laytons' house, he told Ramirez. There's something they're not telling us. Ramirez nodded in agreement. That locked cabinet seemed important. Thomas picked up the phone, ready to make the call. This could be the breakthrough we need, he said with determination in his voice. They prepared for the next steps. The police arrived at the Laytons' house with a search warrant in hand. Mrs. Layton answered the door, her face falling as she saw the document. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling. We need to search your house, Detective Thomas said firmly. Mr. Layton appeared behind her, looking equally distressed. This isn't necessary, he protested. We have nothing to hide. The officer stepped inside, determined to uncover the truth. The officers quickly located the locked cabinet in the living room. Here it is, Officer Ramirez said, pointing. Detective Thomas nodded, signaling for it to be opened. With a few swift movements, the lock was broken and the cabinet door creaked open, revealing a stack of old letters and photographs. "These are of the Harper family," Ramirez observed, sifting through the items. The Laytons watched in silence, fear evident in their eyes. Among the items in the cabinet, Officer Ramirez pulled out a worn diary. "This looks like it belonged to Mrs. Harper," he said, handing it to Detective Thomas. Thomas carefully opened the diary, flipping through the pages filled with detailed entries. "We might find some answers in here," he said in a low voice. The Laytons exchanged worried glances as Thomas began to read the entries aloud. As Detective Thomas read through the diary, it became clear there were tensions between the Harpers and the Laytons, secrets that hinted at a complex connection between the two families, much deeper than anyone had suspected. "This could explain a lot," Ramirez said. Thomas reached the final entries of the diary, the night before they disappeared. Mrs. Harper mentioned the Laytons' visit. He read aloud, "There was a confrontation and I felt threatened." The words sent chills through the room. "This changes everything," Thomas said, closing the diary. "We need to bring Bill back in for questioning." The officers left the Laytons' house, the weight of the new information pressing heavily on their minds. Detective Thomas called Bill back into the station. Bill sat nervously, his eyes darting around the room. "We found something at your parents' house," Thomas said, placing Mrs. Harper's diary on the table. "Bill, what's this?" he asked. "Mrs. Harper's diary," Thomas replied. "We need you to take a look and tell us what you know." Bill hesitated, then nodded, his hands trembling as he opened the diary. His face paled as he read through the entries. I had no idea about any of this," he stammered. "I didn't know there were deeper issues between our families. I swear I never knew about the diary or any of these problems," he insisted. Detective Thomas studied him closely, trying to gauge his sincerity. Bill's bewildered expression seemed genuine. Taking a deep breath, Bill spoke up. "There is something that might help," he said. "Evan and I had a secret hiding spot in our old treehouse. We used to leave messages for each other there." "Where is this treehouse?" Detective Thomas asked. "It's still in my parents' backyard," Bill replied. "Maybe there's something there that can shed more light on what happened." The police decided to search the treehouse. Detective Thomas and Officer Ramirez followed Bill to his parents' backyard. The treehouse looked old and weathered, but still sturdy. "It's up there," Bill pointed. The officers climbed up and began searching. "Let's hope we find something useful," Thomas said. They carefully inspected every nook and cranny, looking for any hidden messages or clues about the Harper family's disappearance. Inside the treehouse, Officer Ramirez found a small wooden box. "Look at this," he said, handing it to Thomas. They opened it to find a series of handwritten notes exchanged between Bill and Evan. "These might be what we need," Thomas said, reading through them. The notes were filled with typical childhood chatter, but also hinted at deeper concerns. As Detective Thomas read the notes, a pattern emerged. "Evan was scared," he said, looking at Bill. "He wrote about his parents hiding something important from him." Bill's eyes widened in shock. "I never knew he felt this way," he said softly. The notes hinted at secrets and fears that Evan had kept hidden. "We need to figure out what he was talking about," Thomas said, his mind racing with possibilities. One note caught Detective Thomas's attention. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a sentence. Evan mentioned a place in the woods where he planned to go if things got worse. He turned to Bill. "Do you know where this place could be?" Bill shook his head. "I have no clue," he admitted. Thomas frowned, determined to find this place. "We need to search the woods," he decided, hoping to uncover more clues. Detective Thomas quickly organized a search party. "We need to comb through the woods," he instructed his team, using the directions from Evan's note. "This could be our best lead yet," Thomas said, his voice filled with determination. The officers geared up and prepared to venture into the dense forest, hoping to find the place Evan mentioned and any clues it might hold. After hours of searching, the team stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. "Over here," Officer Ramirez called out. "The cabin is partially hidden by overgrowth and debris." "This must be the place," Detective Thomas said, feeling a surge of hope. The team cautiously approached the cabin, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. "Let's see what we can find," Thomas urged, his heart pounding with anticipation. Inside the cabin, the team made a chilling discovery. "Look at this," Ramirez said, holding up a toy. "These belongings are the Harper family's. Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day." Now, back to the story. Detective Thomas picked up a piece of clothing, recognizing it from old photos. "They were definitely here," he said, his voice tense. The cabin held signs of recent habitation, confirming the Harpers had been there before disappearing. "We need to figure out what happened next," Thomas said, determined to uncover the truth. Detective Thomas and his team surveyed the cabin's interior. Clothes, toys, and various personal items were scattered everywhere. "This confirms the Harpers were here," Thomas said, picking up a child's shoe. Officer Ramirez nodded. "Examining a family photo," he added. "They must have stayed here for a while." The atmosphere was thick with unease as they realized the significance of their find. "Let's keep searching," Thomas urged, hoping to uncover more. As they continued to search, Detective Thomas noticed something odd. "There's a loose board here," he said, prying it up to reveal a hidden trapdoor. "Looks like it leads to a basement," he observed, shining his flashlight down the dark stairway. "Let's check it out," Officer Ramirez said, following Thomas down. The air grew colder as they descended, the promise of more clues pulling them forward. In the basement, they discovered a makeshift living area. "Looks like they stayed down here for quite some time," Officer Ramirez noted, pointing to the bedding and food supplies. Detective Thomas picked up a family photo lying on a small table. "This wasn't just a quick hideout," he said, realizing the extent of the Harpers' stay. They were trying to escape something serious. The room was filled with the weight of their discovery. Among the items in the basement, Detective Thomas found a journal. "This belongs to Mr. Harper," he said, flipping through the pages. The entries detailed their plans to leave town, citing a threat from the Laytons. "They were scared," Thomas said, reading aloud. "They felt they had no other choice but to disappear." Officer Ramirez frowned, absorbing the implications. "This changes everything," he said. "We need to find out more." The final entry in the journal was the most revealing. Mr. Harper mentioned meeting someone who promised to help them disappear. Detective Thomas read aloud. "This person could be the key to understanding what happened." The entry raised more questions than answers. Who was this person? Officer Ramirez wondered. And why did they want to help the Harpers? Thomas closed the journal, determination in his eyes. "We need to find out," he said. Detective Thomas zeroed in on finding the mysterious person who promised to help the Harpers disappear. "We need to dig into their connections," he told his team. "Look for anyone they might have reached out to for help." The officers started reviewing old records and contacts. "Whoever this person is, they hold the key to solving this case," Thomas said, determination clear in his voice. The team began tracing phone records and financial transactions from 30 years ago. "This is going to be a long shot," Officer Ramirez said, sorting through the data. "Wait, here's something," he added, pointing to a suspicious payment. It was made to a private investigator. Detective Thomas leaned over to look. "Let's find out who this PI was and see what they know," he said, hope rekindled. The private investigator's name was Mr. Simmons. "Looks like he retired and moved out of state," Officer Ramirez reported. "Let's track him down," Thomas said. After some digging, they found his new address. "We need to talk to him and see if he remembers anything about the Harpers," Thomas instructed the team. They quickly made arrangements to contact the now-retired investigator. Detective Thomas called Mr. Simmons, explaining the situation. "We need to discuss your involvement with the Harper family," he said. Simmons was hesitant, but agreed to an interview. "I can meet you tomorrow," he offered. "Perfect, thank you," Thomas replied. The next day, Thomas and Ramirez prepared for the interview, hoping Simmons could provide the breakthrough they needed. During the interview, Mr. Simmons revealed crucial information. "The Harpers hired me to help them relocate," he confessed. "They were scared of the Laytons and felt threatened." Detective Thomas leaned in. "What did you do for them?" Simmons sighed. I arranged everything for their new identities and location. Thomas nodded, taking notes. This is huge. Ramirez whispered. We need more details. Thomas pressed for further information. Mr. Simmons provided more details about the Harpers' plans. They intended to move to a small town in another state, he said. I helped them create new identities. Detective Thomas took notes, intrigued. They were desperate to start over, Simmons continued. They felt they had no choice but to disappear. Thomas nodded, absorbing the information. Do you have any records of their new identities? He asked. Simmons shook his head. Only coded message. S, he replied. We used a series of codes to keep their plans secret from the Laytons. These messages detailed every step of their relocation. Detective Thomas leaned forward, interested. Can you decode them for us? He asked. Simmons nodded, handing over a notebook filled with codes. These should help you understand their plans, he said. Thomas thanked him, ready to delve into the cryptic notes. Back at the station, Detective Thomas and his team analyzed the codes. These lead to a safe deposit box in a nearby city, Officer Ramirez pointed out. Let's head there and see what we find, Thomas said, determined to uncover more clues. This could be the key to solving the mystery. The team quickly made their way to the city, determined to uncover more clues. As they approached their destination, excitement built. They accessed the safe deposit box, their hearts pounding. Inside, they found documents and money meant for the Harpers' new life. This is incredible, Officer Ramirez said, examining the contents. These papers detail their new identities, Thomas noted, flipping through the documents. The money was substantial enough to start over. We have solid evidence now, Thomas said, feeling a surge of triumph. Let's confront the Laytons with this. Detective Thomas returned to the Laytons' house, evidence in hand. We need to talk, he said, his tone serious. Mr. and Mrs. Layton looked nervous as they sat down. We found the Harper documents and money, Thomas began, laying out the evidence. It's time for the truth. Mr. Layton's face turned pale. What do you mean? He stammered. We know you were involved, Thomas said firmly. It's time to come clean. Under intense pressure, Mr. Layton finally broke down. All right. We were blackmailing the Harpers, he admitted, his voice shaking. We had dirt on them from a past crime. Detective Thomas leaned in. What kind of crime? Layton hesitated, then continued. Something from years ago before they moved here. We used it to control them. Thomas nodded, scribbling notes. And what happened the night they disappeared? He pressed, eager for more answers. Mr. Layton revealed the cause of the argument. The Harpers refused to comply any longer, he said. They were tired of being under our thumb. Mrs. Layton chimed in. They threatened to expose everything. The confrontation escalated quickly. It was a heated argument, Mr. Layton admitted, but we never intended for them to disappear. Detective Thomas nodded, sensing they were finally getting closer to the truth. Go on, he urged. Both Laytons insisted they never meant to harm the Harpers. We just wanted to keep our leverage, Mr. Layton explained. Detective Thomas frowned. So you say, but blackmail is serious, he responded. Mrs. Layton looked desperate. We thought we could manage it, she said quietly. But it all spiraled out of control. Thomas shook his head, knowing there was no excuse for their actions. With the confession in hand, Detective Thomas moved swiftly. Mr. and Mrs. Layton, you're under arrest for blackmail and obstruction of justice, he declared. The Laytons looked stunned as they were handcuffed. You can't do this, Mr. Layton protested. Yes, we can, Thomas replied firmly. This case is officially reopened. Officer Ramirez read them their rights. We have what we need, Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. With the Laytons in custody, Detective Thomas turned his focus to finding the Harpers. Using the clues from Mr. Simmons, the team began tracing financial transactions. We need to see where they've been living, Thomas said. The trail led to various small towns, indicating the Harpers had been living quietly under new identities. We're getting closer, Officer Ramirez said, checking the latest transactions. Let's keep following the trail, Thomas urged, determination in his eyes. Detective Thomas and his team meticulously followed the trail of financial transactions. They've been living quietly under new identities, he noted. We're almost there. The excitement in the room was palpable as they closed in on the Harpers' new location. After weeks of tracking, Detective Thomas finally located the Harpers in a small town, living as a different family. He said, showing the team a photo. The Harpers looked happy and safe, completely unaware of the recent events. We need to approach them carefully, Thomas advised. They prepared for the delicate task of revealing their true identities. Detective Thomas approached the Harpers' home, heart pounding. When they opened the door, he gently explained, I'm Detective Thomas. We know who you really are. The Laytons have been arrested. He continued, You're safe now. Mrs. Harper's eyes filled with tears. We thought this day would never come, she said. Mr. Harper nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you, he whispered, overwhelmed by the news. The Harpers were initially stunned but soon expressed relief and gratitude. We can't believe it's over, Mr. Harper said, holding his wife's hand. Detective Thomas nodded. We need your help to make sure the Laytons face justice, he said. The Harpers agreed to return and testify against the Laytons. We'll do whatever it takes, Mrs. Harper said firmly. It's time to close this chapter for good, Mr. Harper added. The Harpers returned to their original town, a mix of emotions swirling. Old friends welcomed them back with open arms. We missed you so much, one neighbor said, tears in her eyes. The Harpers prepared for the upcoming trial, ready to face the past. It's good to be home, Mr. Harper said, looking around the familiar streets. We're ready to set things right, Mrs. Harper agreed, determination in her voice. Detective Thomas stood before the gathered reporters, cameras flashing. Today, we announced the resolution of a 30-year-old mystery, he began. The Harper family, missing for decades, has been found, and the Laytons have been arrested. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thanks to relentless investigation, justice has been served, Thomas continued. The town's relief was palpable. The weight of the long unsolved case was finally lifting. Once haunted by the Harper disappearance, the town erupted in celebration. Banners were hung, and neighbors gathered to share stories and rejoice. It's like a weight has been lifted, one resident said. We're so happy to have the Harpers back and to see justice done. The mood was festive, filled with a sense of closure. Detective Thomas watched, feeling proud of the community's resilience and joy. The trial of the Laytons began, the courtroom packed with townspeople and reporters. The Harpers took the stand, their testimony crucial. We lived in fear for years, Mr. Harper said, his voice steady. Mrs. Harper nodded, adding, The Laytons controlled us through threats and blackmail. Their words painted a vivid picture of the past. Detective Thomas watched, knowing their courage was pivotal in seeking justice. The court found the Laytons guilty, sentencing them to prison. Cheers erupted outside the courthouse. Justice has been served, Detective Thomas said to Officer Ramirez. The verdict brought closure to the town, ending a chapter that had long troubled them. The Harpers embraced relief, washing over their faces. It's finally over, Mr. Harper said, tears in his eyes. The town could finally move forward, free from the shadows of the past. With the Laytons behind bars, the Harpers decided to return to their original town. This is where we belong, Mrs. Harper said. They began rebuilding their lives, reconnecting with old friends, and finding new purpose. It's strange, but it feels like coming home, Mr. Harper said, smiling. The community welcomed them back warmly, ready to support them. Detective Thomas knew their journey was far from over, but saw it as a new beginning. He stood proudly as the police chief, pinned a commendation on his uniform. For your perseverance and dedication in solving the Harper case, the chief announced. The room erupted in applause. You never gave up, Officer Ramirez said, shaking Thomas's hand. Thank you, Thomas replied, humbled. The recognition meant a lot, but knowing the Harpers were safe was the real reward. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The town gathered for a ceremony honoring the Harpers and Detective Thomas. Banners and balloons decorated the town square. Today, we celebrate the end of a long-standing mystery, the mayor said. The Harpers stood beside Thomas, smiles all around. We're grateful for everyone who never gave up on us, Mr. Harper said, tears in his eyes. The crowd cheered, the air filled with joy and relief. It was a day of healing and new beginnings.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.